Hello everyone, good day. Welcome to this video lecture where we talk about chapter 1, the introduction. This chapter is part of the research proposal. So in the behavioral sciences department, these are the different parts of the chapter 1, and these are background of the study, review of the related literature, conceptual framework, problem statement or statement of the problem, research hypothesis, definition of terms, significance of the study, and scope and limitation. So we're going to be talking about what are the expected contents for each of all of these specific parts, except of course the parts that we have already discussed, like for example research hypothesis, review of related literature, and a bit about the conceptual framework and the problem statement as well. So remember that when you are writing the whole paper, the proposal and the final manuscript, you have to follow the American Psychological Association 7th edition in terms of the format, the writing, the style, the grammar, the parts, the in-text citation, and also the referencing at the end. Now, I won't be able to discuss those specifics in this specific video lecture, but I already provided you with the APA 7 book, and also you can look into videos and other learning materials available in the internet for you to be able to make use of the APA 7th edition. So the first part of the introduction is the background of the study. So what does the background of the study do, or in that specific write-up, what is the goal? The goal is to be able to establish the socio-cultural and historical context and the relevance of your study. And then you have to argue here, why is this specific study important? So how do you accomplish this? For example, you're doing a study regarding a specific disease, like for example HIV and AIDS, and you want to see whether or not they are physically active while having their chronic infection. So probably you can start arguing the importance of your study by saying that there's a lot of that HIV is a pandemic, and globally this is the number of statistics of people who are infected with HIV. In Asia, this is the number of people infected with HIV. In the Philippines, there is a growing number of people with HIV, and you're going to explain probably that one of the things that they are dealing with is being able to have social participation because of the stigma that they are experiencing, and because of decreased social participation, they might not want to engage in sports, or they don't want to engage in physical activity, and therefore you're doing this research for you to be able to see what is the baseline and what are the different factors that influences a person living with HIV in terms of engaging in physical activities, exercise, or sports. So in that way, in the way you are arguing that that specific narrative, you are telling that that this research is important. This research is embedded in the current social environment, and then it's also based on recent issues. So you can probably also look into current events, what is happening in society during the period that you're doing this specific study. That's the reason why you are doing this specific study, or you are engaging in these types of concepts, etc. So arguing the importance by trying to draw a story of why this is important and why this is needed by society at the moment. That is your goal in terms of doing your background of the study. Okay, so next, you have to establish the theoretical and disciplinary relevance of your study. So in the beginning, you engage in that discourse, or you discuss how this is important to society, why this is relevant and why this is novel, and but also in the background of the study, you have to mention why this is important in your current field. For example, you're doing a research and you are a sports studies major. Why is this certain paper important in sports studies? Why is it related to sports studies? And why is this study needed in the field of sports studies? How does your paper extend the knowledge within that specific field of area of study within sports studies. So that's how you establish disciplinary relevance of your study. So probably you're also going to tell us a little bit about your research gap, what is not yet known in the literature that you are trying to address, that your research is trying to make up for. And when you have already articulated that, it's also important that at the end of the study, you briefly articulate your research problem. So you already introduce what do you want to do with your study. Usually you just re-articulate the general statement of the problem that you will be writing in full details when you go to the statement of the problem section later. But here you will just tell them, so this is what is happening in society, this is the need, this is the current need in society, this is the current state of society in relation to the topic that I'm trying to look into. This is what my study is going to be for. This is the state of of sports studies, in the current state. This is the areas wherein knowledge is lacking, and therefore this is my study. My study is this, with a hope that I am trying to address certain issues or certain gaps in society and in the field of knowledge in sports studies. And because you are going to make some claims in your background of the study, like for example, you will be going to be stating statistics. Like for example, you are going to study about sports and how nutrition and eating habits has something to do with sports activity, and you're going to be presenting statistics of undernourished children or overnourished children, or those with malnutrition. So you have to cite the sources for all of the claims that you are stating in your background of the study. So remember to cite your sources. So this write-up isn't so long, you just have to take around 2 to 3 pages of the whole APA styled paper for you to be able to accomplish this task of the background of the study. So in a span of 2 to 3 pages, you should have already established why this study is important in society, in the Philippines, and why is this important to sports studies in general. It is followed by the review of related literature, and we've discussed this very profusely in the previous video lecture, so I will not repeat all of the concepts that I have discussed here. But just to review, you have to present, discuss, and critically appraise the scholarly research related to the topic of your choice, because you have to present to your reader, this is the extent of research that has already been done in the topic that I am interested in, because we want to guide the reader in terms of critically appraising what is already there, what knowledge we know, because at the end we will have to identify what is not yet known, and among those that is not yet known or the research gaps in the study, we are going to situate our own study so that we are able to extend the knowledge within a specific area of literature, or a specific area of study, In terms of format, the subsections must be based on concepts and variables of interest in the study. So I don't know what you have been taught in your previous schools or in your previous classes, but some schools, they would do, they would separate literatures with studies, which is, for me, is quite nonsensical, because all studies are literature, and we're looking for scholarly studies, whether that is a theoretical study or a review or an actual empirical study. So these are all found. So, and then some schools or some classes would divide the related literature review according to local and foreign literature, which again, for me, is nonsensical. I think it's important that you have to divide the literature and you identify subsections of the literature based on the different variables in the study, especially in quantitative research. So what are the variables in the study? You have to identify them, all right? And that will be the different sections of your study. And of course, for each section, all the studies that you will put there, that you will summarize, that you will critically appraise, and that you will integrate with one another. You already integrate there the different contexts, no? Who are the people being studied in the specific studies that you are putting in? Where is it done? Is it elsewhere, in the Philippines, in Asia, in another country, right? What were the variables or the different ways they attack the variables? What is the definition of the variable that you are discussing in a specific section? No, all of this should have already been put in a specific section. All right. So, and then of course, within that section, you have to see the relationship of that specific variable to the main phenomenon of the study, which is in the one that's in the middle of your conceptual schema, of your conceptual framework. So that is how we arrange or organize our writing in related literature review. Okay, it's based on the concepts and variables of interest in the study. So always think about the related literature must be aligned with your conceptual framework, must be aligned with your problem statement, must be aligned with your definition of terms. Remember that very important principle, because that is what your readers and what your panel of examiners will check, especially if it's a quantitative research. Are the concepts in my conceptual framework aligned with and consistent with my problem statement? Is it also consistent with the way you organize your related literature review? Is it also consistent and aligned with the way you arrange your topics or your concepts in the definition of terms? And later on in the methodology, there's also a question of whether your concepts is also aligned with the instruments or the survey tools that you're going to use in your study. So always remember that there should be alignment in all of the concepts in the study through and through, from chapter 1, chapter 2. And then there is a last section after you've discussed all of the concepts, the variables, and relationships being tested in the study. In your related literature, you have to end with a one-page synthesis where you compare and contrast key findings and identify the gaps. So very important that, for you to be able to showcase your knowledge of the literature that you've collected and what you've learned from this literature, you have to now identify the gap in literature. So what have not yet been studied, or what areas is there not much study yet? And then, of course, again, tell your reader that this is the gap and this is the specific gap that I'm trying to address with my study. Therefore, say your study purpose, or say your problem statement, the general problem statement. Next, we have the conceptual framework. So, your conceptual framework is highly related to the conceptual schema or the conceptual paradigm that I asked you to do. But like I said, in the earlier parts, we're just doing the conceptual schema as a logic model for us to be able to imagine the relationships of your phenomenon, your main phenomenon, with antecedent variables and outcome variables. But this time, you have to now fully explain that schema. And remember, the schema that we made is just an initial schema, an initial conceptual framework, because like I said, when you get into the literature, you might be able to find out that maybe the logic model that you have created in the beginning of the study doesn't really hold water, because there's not really much research being done about it, and most research were doing it this way, and it seems like this way is more valid and reliable compared to the original logic model that you're doing. So probably across, while you're doing your literature, you might have changes of mind in terms of, you have to change the name of the variable in your outcome, or you have to change the name of the variable in your antecedents, because you feel like there are other more relevant ways of looking at these factors. At the same time, while you're doing your related literature review, it's also very important to see the components that are found inside each variable. Like, for example, there's a plethora of socio-demographic factors. You have age, gender, year level. You also have family income or personal income, right? You have religion, religious affiliation, you have civil status. But you're not going to use all of those social demographic factors in your study. You just have to use the specific components that are important, and then that are really related logically and empirically in your study. So you don't have to choose all of them. You just have to choose specific ones. Okay, so the related literature exploration that you're doing is the one that's going to help you figure out which variables or which indicators or which components of each variable is relevant to be included in your study. You're not going to include all. Anyway, as I explained, the conceptual framework presents a visual representation and textual discussion of the concepts to be measured in the study and the relationships or the hypothesis to be tested. So it begins with, number one, you have to present your conceptual paradigm, I usually call it a schema, but in other, it is also called, or it is more commonly known as the conceptual paradigm. It's the visual representation of the variables and the relationships that you're assuming in the variables. So the schema that you've created, the boxes, that you draw arrows to the main variable and then another arrow going to the outcome variable. That is the paradigm. And so whatever final paradigm you have decided after you've explored the literature, that is going to be what is found in that specific conceptual paradigm. And then, of course, you have to label it based on APA style, so you have to check how to properly label figures or diagrams like that. And then the second part of the conceptual framework is a textual explanation of the nature of each concept and the assumed relationships, and you have to cite the works that have suggested the relationships in the study, in the RRL, So you have to put it in that specific section. So when we say nature of concept, I mean you have to identify the sub-variables or domains or dimensions which serve as components of the variables. And like I said, it should be based on whatever your RRL is saying as what is relevant. Like for example, if your variable in the antecedent, one of them is social demographic profile, you have to choose whether or not you have to include age, gender, civil status, income status, religious affiliation, educational background. You have to you cannot choose all. No, you have to just choose the specific social demographic profile that makes sense, makes most sense for your study. Like for example, you're trying to look at physical literacy. Do you think that you really have to include civil status as an antecedent under social demographic profile for physical literacy? I feel like you won't be able to find a lot of RRL to support that. But I think age would be something that is really related to which gender maybe, So you have to really critically dive into the literature to be able to find out which of the concepts within a specific variable needs to be included in the study. And you have to explain that within the text, Or for example, one of your antecedent variables is social support, for example, support. So how can we probably conceptualize that? So probably it's the indicators for social support is support from family, support for peers, support from teammates, and probably we're putting teammates here because we are speaking of this from the context of athletes or sport. But I think when we talk about other forms of population like the general adolescent population, I wouldn't put teammates here because not everyone is involved in a sport and therefore they don't have a teammate. So again, for the concept of social support, at least for the studies probably involving athletes, or athletes in group sports, this may be the important indicators of social support: family, peers, teammates. So you have to again identify that, and again identifying these conceptualizations of each variable is not something that is just based on what you feel is best. It has to be supported by literature because, like I said in the previous slide here, you have to cite works that say that this is how you should really conceptualize it, and this is how you really have to identify the relationships between between the concepts. Okay, so for example, this is your original schema, right? So you're trying to see, or just explore physical fitness, and you're trying to see how it's related to its antecedents, social demographic profile, household characteristic, and eating habits, and how it is also related to its assumed outcome, which is the physical well-being. So, first, you have to identify what are the different concepts that are included for each variable in the study. So, for example, in social demographic profile, probably your literature will tell you that what you need to include here are age, probably gender. Because we are, for example, where the population of your study, let's say, are children, right? So, probably look at age, gender. Probably that's it, age and gender as part of social demographic profile. Next, for household characteristics, maybe in relation to physical fitness of the students, maybe this has something to do with, let's say, family income, and probably also type of family, like if it's an extended family or a nuclear family. Probably also you can also look at the floor area of the house, and probably you can also look at household size, meaning how many are there living in that specific household. So family income, type of family, floor area of house, household size. Maybe this has something to do based on the literature on physical fitness. Next, for eating habits, maybe you can look at, quantity of the food that they're eating, like how often do they eat, and probably you can also look at the quality of the food that they're eating, like what type of food do they eat and how frequent do they eat that, like for example, fish, meats, dairy, sweets, etc. Probably that would be how you would. And of course, these things, based on the literature, is related to physical fitness. For physical fitness, you also have to have conceptualizations or indicators for this. Probably number of active hours, maybe, meaning how many hours in a day do they engage in some sort of activity, Probably also the type of exercises being done by the students, right? Etc. etc. Probably in social demographic profile, maybe we can also look at schooling, like are they enrolled in a school, or what is their grade level, can also look at that. And then physical well-being, maybe you can look at, absence of symptoms, like they don't have any disease, absence of symptoms could be one, what else could be physical well-being? Also engaging in physical engaging in protective behaviors, in terms of health, like for example brushing teeth, etc. etc. So this could be, and probably you have more. So this is what we mean by, what is the nature of the variable. You have to look into what are the specific indicators that you need for each of the concepts found in your paradigm. Alright, and what is the basis for all of these things? The basis, there should be support from the RRL. So when you write the text for this, after you have I decided on this, where do you when you put the text here in the conceptual framework part, there should be RRL support. Okay, so the first paragraph of the conceptual framework after presenting the schema is the main variable of the study, which is of course physical fitness. That's the main variable of the study, and you want to conceptualize it. So physical fitness, what is it about, and how do you plan to measure it in terms of a number of active hours and the type of exercise, and maybe you have more in relation to physical fitness. And then the second discussion is social demographic profile. This one, okay? You have to discuss what are the components of social demographic profile in your study, and then you also have to explain what is the relationship of social demographic profile to physical fitness. And after saying that, this is the relationship, you have to support with literature, so you have to cite your sources. And then the third paragraph will be about household characteristics. Okay, so household characteristics. Okay, so you have to identify what is household characteristics, what are the different components of household characteristics, and then you're going to cite studies that establish the relationship between household characteristic and physical fitness. Now, the citation here should not be as long as what you have indicated in the related literature. No? So this is just really more of citing as forms of sources or evidence that you are really trying to test a legitimate relationship between household characteristic and physical fitness. So this is paragraph 1, paragraph 2, paragraph 3 for household characteristic, and paragraph 4 is your eating habits. Alright? So, explain what are the different components of eating habits. So, it's going to be measured in terms of quantity and quality. Right? And then you have to establish its relationship with physical fitness through again, citing the studies. And then finally, paragraph number 5 is physical well-being. Describe what physical well-being is in your study. What are the components of physical well-being in your study? And also establishing the relationship of physical fitness to physical well-being by, again, citing sources. Alright? So, we expect that at least for this type, of conceptual paradigm, you will have 5 paragraphs, trying to describe each of the concepts in this schema, as briefly but as comprehensive as possible, as briefly but as succinct as possible, and defining the components and relating it to the main variable in question. Also, in your conceptual framework, you can also explain, because sometimes some of the concepts we are analyzing is based on a theory. For example, your research is based on the theory of Abraham Maslow. So that's why you are going to use biological, physiologic needs, safety and security needs. You also have to include that in the discussion in the conceptual framework, just in case you are using a theory. Okay? And then the next part is the statement of the problem. I will no longer discuss the parts of this because I've discussed this in the previous lecture in terms of identifying the topic and narrowing down the topic. But as we know, it is general statement of the problem and the specific research questions. And I will repeat this over and over again. The statement of the problem must be aligned with the conceptual framework or the conceptual paradigm. Okay? So, you cannot ask questions in the problem that has not been indicated in the paradigm. Okay, so I hope that's clear by now. And now, if you made changes in the paradigm while you were doing your review of related literature exploration, any change that you make in your paradigm, it will affect the other important parts like the statement of the problem. So you also have to change that as well. And then, of course, we discussed about this research hypothesis already, and that the correct form in terms of research hypothesis is null, complex, and non-directional. And remember, based on the schema that you've created and the relationships that you're tested, that's the number of hypotheses that you have. So, in this schema, which most of you also have, this one is hypothesis number 1, H1, and this one is hypothesis number 2. So make sure that you, again, it has to be aligned. When I read the hypothesis, it has to also be aligned with the relationships being tested in the conceptual paradigm. All right. Next, we have the definition of terms. So for definition of terms, it is just like defining in a dictionary, but however, it's more nuanced and specific than that. So here, you have to define the concepts found in your conceptual framework arranged according to appearance, top to bottom, left to right. So for example, this is our conceptual schema. So we are going to define social demographic profile first, and then household characteristics, and then eating habits, and then physical fitness, and then physical well-being. All right? And then, after that, you have to begin with a conceptual definition. What is a conceptual definition? So, conceptual definition is a widely accepted definition. So, big sabi, it's a lexical definition, so something that you would see in the dictionary, but not really see in a dictionary, but it's more of a theoretical definition, right? So, how did the theorists that you based your study from how did the theory that you based your study from define your conceptual framework, or your concept they define your concept in the study? So how did they define social demographic profile? So, and because this is something that's theoretical or widely accepted, you have to cite, so surname and then year. But after that, you also have to give an operational definition. The operational definition is how the concept is measured in the study, and then use the dimensions identified by the conceptual framework and the instrument that you will be creating later. So the definition of terms is kind of, while you're doing the protocol, it's kind of a live document because it will keep on changing based on the items that you put in your instrument. So just to give you a snapshot of how that looks like. So you're going to be defining social demographic profile, right? Household characteristics, eating habits, physical fitness, and physical well-being. Now you have to define social demographic profile first conceptually, and then use a citation for the conceptual definition that's based from a theory or based from a widely accepted source, right? And then what you do there is and then you have to define operationally and define it based on the concept. So, for example, in this study, it is the social demographic profile will include age, gender, and schooling. Right? So, for household characteristics, also you do the same. For eating habits, you do the same, etc., etc. Okay? So, for the meantime, while we're just starting to write chapter 1, that's how you will do it. But later, when you now create your instrument, your survey tool, for instance, in order for you to measure these things quantitatively, you will refine your definition of terms, especially in the operational definition, based on the items that you have included in your survey tool. For example, probably for social support here, probably for social support, originally what you want to do is just to count the number of family, count the number of family members who are supportive, count the number of peers who are supportive, or count the number of teammates who are supportive. Or you can just do a scale. For example, a question like, how many, to what extent do you feel that you are being supported by your family? 1 being the least supported and 5 being the most supported, and then they just measure it that way. Now, measurement 1, counting the number of people, and number 2, introducing a scale to measure the level of supportiveness are 2 different things. At the moment, we have not defined that yet, whether we're going to count the number of supportive people or we're going to identify the level of support. Now, once you've established whatever it is, it has to be stated in the definition of terms, because you have to be very, very specific. Like when you are measuring household characteristics, like how do you measure family income? How do you measure type of family? Because there are many different ways of measuring type of family. It could be nuclear or extended, right? Or it could be a father-headed family, a mother-headed family, or a blended family. We're in a blended, a mixed leadership family. So there are many ways of defining or measuring the family. Now, when you have decided the best way to be able to measure that has to be indicated in the operational definition. Now, in some panel of examiners would want a separate definition for each. Kunyari, may definition siya for age, for gender, for schooling, for family income, for type of family, for floor area of the house and household size. Some panel of examiners would want that. Alright? So you have to communicate well with whoever your mentor is going to be, in terms of, whether we need to not just define the concept but also define the subdimensions of in each variable. So that's something that you have to decide on and think about, and converse with your mentor. In our class, we'll try to do that, defining every indicator so that you just know how it's done, and of course we will have consultations for you to be able to see whether you're doing it correctly or not. So here is an example of how you can write the definition of terms. So for instance, one of your main concepts is, or main variable is, your student engagement, right? So as you can see here in the first part, this is a definition of student involvement based on a widely accepted definition, and then we cited it because it was not our definition, it was the definition of Astin. So the amount of physical and psychological energy that the student devotes to the academic experience. And then specifically, we are going to define student engagement or involvement based on the way we will measure it in the study. So here in the study, student involvement is comprised of the level of engagement in school activities, first indicator, membership in school organization, second indicator, and then frequency of interactions with school entities. So we have already defined student engagement. So like I said, you may also need to define per indicator or per component. So that's why I have a second definition here under student engagement, on engagement in school activities. Where did that come from? It came from as one of the components of student involvement. So again, you have both a conceptual definition, example, the participation in a wide skill-based occupation strategies and interactive activities to support students' educational development. There is a citation because, again, this is a conceptual definition, a widely accepted definition. And then you are again going to define it based on the way you will measure it in your study, as in curricular, co-curricular, and extracurricular activities. But then again, this can change based on what will be found later in your instrument found in chapter 2. So at the moment, we just put it this way because this is what your RRL is saying. But in the creation of after creating the instrument, you might want to revisit this later. So same thing, you will define membership in school organization. So here you will put a conceptual definition followed by a citation and then the operational definition based on how you're going to use it in the study. And we'll also define frequency of interaction. So as you can see, it's indented because these three are all under student involvement, as we have mentioned in its definition of terms. So for example, you have the next one, mental health. So you have your state of physical well-being, in the way the individual realize their abilities, can cope with normal stresses in life, and can work productively, is able to make a contribution to their community according to WHO. So this again is a conceptual definition that's widely accepted, that's why we cite. But then in our study, we will measure it specifically as psychological well-being and psychological distress. So we will define psychological well-being, conceptual definition, operational definition, and then followed by psychological distress, a conceptual definition, operational definition. So you will do that for all the concepts found in your conceptual framework. The next part is the significance of the study. Here, it is a short write-up, usually one page or less, basically answers what is the contribution of your paper to your field, of sports and sports studies, how will this help in terms of generation of new knowledge. And number two, so disciplinal or theoretical significance, and also you can mention, but not so much as theoretical, the practical significance. So how do you think that the stakeholders related to the variables and the topics you are measuring will be benefited by the study? So that is your significance of the study. Basically, your answer question, what is the significance of your study? Who will benefit from your study? How will your discipline benefit from the study? And finally, we have scope and delimitation, which is made up of two paragraphs. First paragraph is scope, second paragraph is delimitation. So, you have to answer the question, what is the scope in terms of concepts that you're going to measure. So these concepts will be the ones that are found in your conceptual framework. Context, what will it be about? You know, what is the context of your study? For example, in the case of my study on student involvement, it is the context of higher education, student involvement in higher education. So, and then the local, like this is in the Philippines or the Manila, etc., and the respondent. So in my case, I used college students, no. And then the second one is delimitation. What are the things that you are not included in your study? Like for example, for concepts, so for me, I did not. For example, in the way I defined, student involvement, I talked about curricular, co-curricular, extracurricular. So probably I will no longer include activities that involve community or the parents, so those I willfully did not include in my study. So that is my delimitation. What are the contexts that I will not include? So I will not include I will probably not include so I'm talking about colleges, but I will not be including masters or the PhD level, And for the local, so I will just be including one school, or how many schools based on. And then the respondents that I will not include, as I explained, probably I will not include irregular students or I will not include postgraduate students. So what will you not be including in your study? That is the answer to the limitation. And then the guide is concepts. So what are the concepts that could be expected but you did not include in the study? The context, local, and respondents that you did not include. So 2 paragraphs, usually 1 page or less write-up on this one. So in this section, we had a brief discussion on the different parts of chapter 1, which is entitled Introduction. So we discussed about background of the study, review of related literature, conceptual framework, problem statement of the problem, hypothesis of the study, definition of terms, significance of the study, and scope and delimitation.